Okay, I have 5 o'clock on my clock here, so we'll get started. Thank you all for joining us today for the final of 7 policy briefings from the National Council of Asian Pacific Americans, or NCAPA. These are all based on our 2020 policy platform. I am David Inoue. I'm the Executive Director of the Japanese American Citizens League, one of the founding member organizations of NCAPA. I'll be serving as moderator, so hopefully you will hear very little from me, so you can hear more from each of our guest speakers we have lined up. Today's briefing is by NCAPA's AAPI Tech Table. The Tech Table was created in recognition of the need for a more unified voice and presence in the national tech and telecom policy debate. We convene regularly to discuss relevant policy concerns while also engaging with industry and other stakeholders to raise the visibility of the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander community. As with all these briefings, you can find more information about NCAPA, and in particular our 2020 policy platform, on the NCAPA website at ncapaonline.org. The Tech Table policy platform is largely split into 2 main areas, privacy and digital inclusion and literacy. In the area of digital privacy, as increasing amounts of information is available on the internet through what we may give willingly, or is collected through our activity, or stored through records such as financial information with our credit card companies, as well as information that's just simply publicly available, but now much more easier to find. And because of that vast amount of information, we must be protected from inappropriate use of the information, and also particularly in the potential of making decisions such as financial, employment, or other areas where there is the great potential for civil rights violations. Facial recognition technology is itself an often frightening proposition, but the inaccuracy of such systems with minority communities is even more disturbing. And finally, with the vast amount of information out there, we believe that consumers have the right to access and control their information. Now, our panel today will be discussing the issues of digital inclusion and literacy, so I'm going to let them go into that area in a little more detail later. But before we go on with our panel, I would like to introduce our 2 congressional representatives who are joining us today, both experts in the field of technology and leaders in creating and shaping policy in this area. First, I am pleased to introduce Representative Ro Khanna, who represents California's 17th Congressional District, located in the heart of Silicon Valley. He's serving in his 2nd term now. Representative Khanna sits on the House Budget, Armed Services, and Oversight Reform Committees, and is the first vice chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. He also serves as an assistant whip for the Democratic Caucus. Congressman Khanna is committed to representing the people and ideas rooted in Silicon Valley to the nation and throughout the world. For each job created in the high-tech industry, another 4 jobs are created. This is referred to as the tech multiplier. Representative Khanna is working to ensure that the technology sector is at the forefront of U.S. economic policy and strives to provide opportunities for those negatively impacted by the digital divide that we will be discussing here today. Representative Khanna was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania during America's bicentennial. I'll leave you all to do the math since this is a tech panel. Both of his parents immigrated to the United States in the 70s from India. Representative Khanna's commitment to public service was inspired by his grandfather, who was active in Gandhi's independence movement and worked with Lala Lajpat Rai in India and spent several years in jail for promoting human rights. Congressman Khanna, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. I'm so honored to be asked to speak to you, and appreciate your leadership, your counsel on Asian American issues, and particularly on technology issues. I know that you're advising and thinking about the role of technology post-COVID, post the Floyd killing, and wanted to share some of my reflections about what we ought to be focused on. First, we have to be focused on the digital divide. I mean, the reality is there's still large parts of the country that don't have access to do Zoom calls. They don't have access to technology. It's an outrage that we don't have high-speed internet in every part of America. Whip Clyburn is going to have an $80 billion bill that he's going to be rolling out. I've been on his task force. We need to mobilize our Congress and the Senate to support that bill so that we finally deliver on the promise of broadband. I mean, I was talking to someone today from a rural community, and they said every year, every election year, we hear about rural broadband, but then nothing happens. We've been hearing about this since the 1990s. This is the time that we make that happen. And I know Congressman Ted Lieu is also going to be speaking to you after me, has been a terrific leader on that issue. The second thing I would say is that we need to talk about equity in tech. I mean, the reality is we still have a huge diversity problem. It's easy to think about the problem of race as the police officer in Minnesota who did something wrong. I think we have to be more introspective and look at the problem within technology. Why is it that Black Americans, Latinx Americans, women are still so underrepresented at tech companies? Why is it that they're so underrepresented in venture capital? Why is it that there's still glass ceilings in certain places for Asian Americans and not being in the positions of the most visible leadership? So we have to have a serious conversation about equity in tech, equity in venture capital investment, equity in senior roles of leadership in tech companies, on the boards. California has a law, of course, about having women on the boards, which I think has been very successful in changing the conversation. We ought to consider race as also a requirement. And I think that is incredibly important as we think about the response to the George Floyd murder. The third thing I would say is privacy laws. People are rightfully concerned about what's happening with their data. They don't know what's happening in an online world to their identity. They're concerned about who's having access to their data, who's targeting them. I've worked with others, and I know Congressman Lieu has worked on a privacy law, Internet Bill of Rights, and how we can get that in a way that doesn't hurt innovation or entrepreneurship, but protects consumer privacy. And that's, I think, an area where the Asian American community should be very engaged. The fourth thing I would say is social media and the role of speech. What is our role to make sure we have free expression, for sure, but hate speech that triggers violence isn't protected. And even hate speech in itself, while it may be protected under the First Amendment, and maybe we don't want platforms just taking it down without notice or process, we probably could say that it shouldn't be amplified. I mean, there's no reason to have targeted hate be going viral on these platforms. And how do we have the conversation about what the values are on social media in a way that's respectful for all communities, including the Asian American community? I think that is an important conversation. And the final thing I will say, though very important, is the digital age is one of, in my view, of cooperation and global engagement. It's not one of isolation. It's not one to have another Cold War with China or Cold War with Asia. It's not a clash of civilizations. And as an Asian American community, we ought to use tech and make sure tech is there to foster exchange of ideas, cooperation on climate change, cooperation in dealing with pandemics. Yes, we have our own values, and yes, we need to make sure that we understand the competition, but we also need to move towards a world where there's greater cooperation and not more confrontation. And technology, it can play a big role in that, and the Asian American diaspora can play a big role in that. So those are the sort of 5 big principles that I would say are so important as we think about a tech future. And your engagement, your involvement in helping us think through this is critical, particularly given your expertise in technology and the lack of expertise about technology in the Congress. With that, I'll defer to my esteemed colleague who's really brilliant on a lot of these issues. I think he's still one of the only computer science graduates who's actually in Congress, and really a source of expertise on many of these issues.
Thank you, Congressman Khanna, for your remarks and for your leadership in this field. It is now my pleasure to introduce Congressman Ted Lieu. Congressman Lieu represents California's 33rd Congressional District in the U.S. House of Representatives. He's now serving in his 3rd term and currently sits on the House Judiciary Committee and the House Foreign Affairs Committee. He was also elected by his Democratic colleagues to serve as the co-chair of the Democratic Policy and Communications Committee, and serves as the vice chair of the LGBT Equality Caucus. He's also co-chair of the Cloud Computing Caucus and whip for the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, which we are all familiar with. I think it's well known that Congressman Lieu is a former active duty officer in the U.S. Air Force and currently serves as a colonel in the reserves stationed at the Los Angeles Air Force Base. Congressman, we are very grateful for your service. And as Congressman Khanna mentioned, he is one of only 4 computer science majors currently serving in Congress, and is therefore frequently sought out for his insight on technology and innovation matters, including cybersecurity, cloud computing, and innovation, as well as the sharing and creative economy. He's also introduced legislation to prioritize consumer safety in technologically advanced cars, as well as legislation that would ensure law enforcement and tech companies protect consumer privacy. Given these backgrounds, the Congressman has established himself as a leader on the environment, cybersecurity, civil liberties, government ethics, and veterans. He's also been a leader in Congress against ethnic and racial profiling and discrimination against the LGBT community, and of course, our own APA community. The Congressman and his family immigrated to the United States when he was 3 years old. Like many immigrant children and children of immigrants, Representative Liu and his brother would help out in the family business, operating gift shops. He graduated from Stanford for his undergraduate degrees in computer science, as mentioned previously, and political science, and then on to Georgetown University for his law degree. Congressman Liu, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, David, for that wonderful introduction. My only correction is I'm actually a recovering computer science major. It was way too hard. That's why I'm in politics. Second, want to really thank Congressman Ro Khanna for his leadership, not just on tech issues, but on human rights issues and a range of other progressive issues. He's been a tremendous leader in the House of Representatives. I look to continue working with him. And I want to thank everyone today participating in this call, and to thank NACAPA for hosting it. I thought I'd talk about 2 specific issues and then one sort of overarching issue. So 2 specific issues are facial recognition and cybersecurity, and then I think the overarching issue is going to be artificial intelligence. So in terms of facial recognition, I'm pleased to see that IBM has said they're not going to sell facial recognition software to police departments at this time. Amazon's put on a 1-year moratorium. I believe some other software vendors have done similar things. And one reason is because we know from a Georgetown study, facial recognition software, that it turns out that it is less accurate when they look at faces of darker complexion. So their software is more accurate for lighter faces, less accurate for darker faces. And then when you deploy that across the nation, what's going to end up happening is you're going to have massive equal protection violations across the country, because there are going to be mistakes that are made, and those mistakes are going to be primarily against people of color. So until they can fix that, I don't think we should have police departments or actually government agencies deploy facial recognition software. So I'm working on legislation to address those issues. There are a number of ways to fix this. One is you could get the software vendors to just work harder on trying to do better at recognizing faces that have darker complexions, or you can actually force them to be less accurate with the lighter complexion faces so that you have parity. At some point, I think we will achieve parity, but we can't deploy these software facial recognition things if we can't make sure that people are treated equally. So we're working on that legislation. And then in terms of cybersecurity, we are way behind both in the public and private sector in defending against hackers, whether it's criminals or terrorist networks or foreign governments. I've introduced legislation. I've gotten laws passed in Congress on cybersecurity. One of the laws that were passed last year basically told the Department of Homeland Security to do a vulnerability study of its own department, and then to hire white hat hackers to hack itself, and then to figure out what those vulnerabilities are so they can fix it. I think we need to do that for a lot more government agencies. And then in the private sector, we continue to see hacks of both big businesses and small businesses. And I just urge anyone who has a business to really look at improving cybersecurity. We're seeing a lot of crimes known as ransomware, where they go in and lock up all your files and then demand a ransom to unlock those files. There's been hospitals, for example, that have been hit with ransomware attacks, where the hackers will say, you know, do you really want to do surgeries without having the medical records? Or do you want to pay us money? and some of these hospitals end up paying the hackers money. Again, there's ways to solve this. You can make duplicate copies of your files. You can improve your cyber defenses. So part of it is just sort of even being aware of these problems and trying to address them. And then as we sort of go forward, artificial intelligence has been a big deal and will become an even bigger deal. We already know that automation has taken a number of manual labor jobs and automated them, and now robots do the work of what humans did in the past. With artificial intelligence, you're seeing a lot more jobs, including white-collar jobs, that are going to disappear. There was an article in Forbes not too long ago that said they expected 200,000 jobs to be lost in the banking industry due to artificial intelligence. And so what's going to end up happening as years go by is you're going to have more and more people with skills that society does not need. So what do you do with that? That is a very large problem. And at some point, I think we're going to have to address it, whether it's, with Andrew Yang's proposal of universal basic income, or whether you pay someone $50,000 to walk your dog, or whatever it is. But you're going to have to, we as society are going to have to figure out a way to deal with the dramatic effects of artificial intelligence, which is going to start taking away skills that previously human beings did, and then artificial intelligence now can do and do better. So with that, look forward to working with all of you as we address these issues. Thank you for having me on. And I appreciate everyone being interested in these really difficult and important issues.
Thank you, Congressman Liu, for your remarks and for your leadership in the House and in KPAC especially. I know, especially since you sit on the Judiciary Committee, it's been a very busy week for you this week with everything going on with the Justice and Policing Act coming up. I think both the congressmen raised some key issues in the area of technology and the API community, particularly around privacy and digital literacy. Like so many other parents this spring, the COVID pandemic forced our family into the ad hoc distance learning and working from home. My wife and I have been juggling our work schedules with our kids' classes, trying to make sure that they were in their Zoom classes when they were supposed to be and not chatting with their friends or online when they weren't supposed to be. And yet it wasn't uncommon for all four of us to be on our own Zoom calls all at the same time. And we're fortunate in that we had enough laptops, tablets, and so on that we could do everything we needed to be. We have a broadband subscription here at home. But it really did highlight, as I saw some of their classmates and so many other students in the District of Columbia, that just did not have the resources or access, or perhaps even the understanding of how to even log into a Zoom call, which for even some of the most tech savvy might have been a challenge just a few months ago. So COVID really has revealed a lot of the disparities in our society, including in this field of technology. So to discuss the digital divide and digital literacy in APA community, we have two panelists from our AAPI Tech Table membership, Maddie Schumacher from OCA, Asian Pacific American Advocates, and John Yang from Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. And then we'll also be joined by Joanne Lee from the Legal Aid Foundation of Los Angeles. To start off, Maddie is a policy and community advocate on a mission to empower AAPI and other communities of color to fight for justice and hold representatives accountable. Having spent years working in the Minnesota State Legislature and the governor's race on education, juvenile justice, and health equity, they are well-versed in legislative and campaign strategy. Before that, they worked under the HHS Office of Minority Health on healthcare access campaigns and professional development in communities of color. Now, as OCA's policy head, they are leading the organization's civil rights advocacy on education, immigration, racial profiling, and civic engagement. Maddie graduated from Macalester College with a degree in American Ethnic Studies, where they were heavily involved in student activism around curriculum change, sexual violence prevention, and land repatriation to Indigenous people. They partnered with the Asian American Organizing Project and worked at the Macalester Department of Multicultural Life, and lectured at neighboring colleges on the role of AAPI activism in Black Lives Matter. As an upperclassman, they served on hiring committees and in the college's racial equity and mental health task forces. Our second panelist, John Yang, is the president and executive director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. He leads the organization's efforts to fight for civil rights and empower Asian Americans to create a more just America for all through public policy advocacy, education, and litigation. John served in the Obama administration as senior advisor for trade and strategic initiatives at the U.S. Department of Commerce, where he was the principal advisor to Secretary Pritzker on issues related to Asia, and worked with the White House and other U.S. agencies on strategic and economic issues concerning the region. Previously, John was a partner with a major Washington, D.C. law firm and also worked in Shanghai, China as legal director for the Asian Pacific operations of a U.S. Fortune 200 company. He has served as the president of NAPABA, as a member of the National Advisory Committee for Race, Ethnicity, and Other Populations with the U.S. Census Bureau. He's also served as a member of the American Bar Association House of Delegates and as the ABA Minority Caucus Chair. In 1998, John co-founded the Asian Pacific American Legal Resource Center, a nonprofit organization dedicated to addressing the direct service legal needs of Asian Pacific Americans in the DC metropolitan area. He's also current co-chair of ANCAPA. Maddie, if you could maybe start us off by explaining the digital divide and how specifically it impacts Asian Americans, who many people perceive as having good access and understanding of the internet.
Of course, thanks so much. Yeah, so first let's talk about what exactly is the digital divide. The digital divide is basically the gap in between folks who have access to digital tools like computers, broadband internet, and those who have literacy for those devices and are able to operate them, and those who don't, right? And the digital divide often falls along other factors that we know of: education, wealth, and income. And the digital divide, as David was referring to, is more important now than ever, as students are learning from home and health and employment resources are primarily digitally accessible. To register for unemployment in this time of the pandemic, or to find in-language health resources, as Joanne is going to talk about, even communicating with loved ones in quarantine is mostly reliant on the internet. And although numerous surveys, as David pointed out, demonstrate that our communities, Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities, enjoy higher rates of broadband access than other communities of color, we actually don't have data that is disaggregated by ethnicity. Also, most of the data that we do have from these surveys focuses on proficient English speakers, and the survey is completed online, which means that the survey is mostly getting results from people who already have access to the internet. So it's not very good at capturing those who don't have access to the internet, right? This is the gap that we're seeing here. And so even though we do have these surveys that say, you know, Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, Native Hawaiians are not doing so bad in terms of having access to the internet and other technology, these surveys are a little skewed, and they're not disaggregated by ethnicity, which is a huge problem for our communities. Based on disaggregated data that we do have around causal factors like education attainment and household income, we can assume that similar disparities exist within tech access and the digital divide between Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander ethnicities. Does that kind of answer your question, David?
And David, you're on mute right now.
You forget. John, did you want to maybe talk a little bit about some of the Tech Table's recommendations for expanding digital inclusion and literacy?
Sure, absolutely. And thank you for having this panel. I think it's an important one. In fact, if you listen to what Representative Liu and Representative Khanna talked about, it really gives you the framework for why all of us see, you know, the technology and telecom as being a core portion of civil rights work that all of us do, because it just impacts us at a different level. Maybe let me also unpack a little bit of what Maddie said in terms of what we're talking about when we're talking about the digital divide, because I think there's also a misunderstanding about what that means. And I would unpack it by using a couple of different terms and trying to be clear about what these terms are. So on one level, what we're talking about is what I would call broadband deployment. And that is, if you are in a particular region, do you even have the ability to get the internet, to get internet at broadband speeds. And that's a difficulty, and particularly in rural areas where the deployment rates are still low. And again, although there's a lack of data, this is going to be a theme that all of us come back to. There's a lack of data. I think the understanding is that certainly in Hawaii and parts of rural areas that Pacific Islanders are, that there is the lack of deployment of internet. So that's one piece when we're talking about where these divides come from. Second piece then goes to what we would call broadband adoption. And that is, okay, your region has the ability to get the internet or ability to get broadband, but can you afford it, right? And this is where those economic indicators that Maddie was talking about come into play so much, right? Is, can you afford the internet? If you can't, there are services that are available that can provide it at an affordable rate. So there's a federal program called Lifeline, and that program provides that people should have access to the internet, a broadband internet at affordable rates. Many companies have different versions of this program. So under Comcast or Xfinity, it would be called Internet Essentials. Under Charter or Spectrum, as their brand, would be Internet Assist. AT&T and Verizon have similar brands as well. And they offered them, especially in the age of COVID-19, and we'll probably come back to this. Many of them are offering them for free during this time period, recognizing, the situation that we are in. But even there, even if you have that ability to adopt, how much do people in these communities know about the ability to get these pieces, subsidized, if you will, internet, and are willing to go out and get that? That's where, if we're talking about recommendations that NCAPA would have, that advocacy organizations would have, is that's where the federal government certainly also has a role to play to help get the word out. Get the word out, especially in an appropriate, language access piece, right? I think some studies have shown that with respect to this type of adoption rate, there's probably a lag of about 27% of people that have access, if you will, or deployment, do not actually adopt for various reasons, right? Part of it is also just lack of knowledge about the usefulness of the internet. That might be hard for us appearing on Zoom, a somewhat educated audience, to believe, but the reality is for many people, they just don't see that connection yet in the same way. Maddie referred to these studies, and I completely agree. They're just so frustrating. They're so frustrating. They're frustrating for an Asian American on multiple levels. First level is, do they even include Asian Americans at all? There was a 2019 Pew study that talked about home broadband adoption rates, missed out on Asian Americans altogether. They had whites, they had blacks, they had Hispanic Americans. Didn't have anything, and then everything else was other, right? So let alone disaggregating within the AAPI community, they didn't even bother to. Right, that's right. They didn't list us. And Maddie's exactly right. Pew also did a study in 2016 that had a 95% internet usage rate by Asian Americans, but that was for English speaking, and it was done by internet. Now we know the Asian American population, AAPI population, has about 1/3 of our population is limited English proficient. So if you extrapolate that 1/3 number, already you can project that there's going to be that divide that's created, whether it is because of adoption rates or something.
That divide often falls along those language proficiency lines already.
That's exactly right. Right. Certainly, you're absolutely right, Maddie. Right. Is that if you look at statistics from other places with African American communities, Latino communities in particular, you could see that correlation even more. Right. Mm-hmm. And then after you get to adoption, then you get to what Maddie talks about in terms of literacy. Right. And it's interesting because even there now, and I don't know if this is industry standard yet, so people that are watching from the industry can correct me if I'm wrong, but I actually think about it in terms of what we might call literacy and then proficiency, right? There is the base literacy as to getting onto the internet and doing some of the basic things on the internet, right? And there already we know, again, there's a divide when you're talking about education levels, language proficiency. But then even if you have the basic literacy, even if you have Internet Essentials or Internet Assist, and you know how to turn on the computer and search something on Google, what both you, David, and Maddie, you guys have pointed out is absolutely true and really been emphasized in COVID-19 is, well, how proficient are you really? And I'll admit, even for myself, I have 2 young kids. And when I'm being asked to log onto Blackboard Collaborative or some other device or other platform to make sure my kids are getting online education, I get scared. If I'm getting scared, I know that certainly for other, working families, they get scared. Even if they do have proficiency, do they have the ability to monitor if you're talking about 2 working parents or a single parent that is working? And so that's where all of the different places that these divides are created. I think there was one study done recently when we're talking about proficiency that probably about nationally, about 75% of the student population is not digitally proficient, right? Mm-hmm. So these are all the different touch points. So when we're talking about recommendations, those problems that I'm outlining is where we would be advocating for changes, right? A lot of it does come to funding in terms of making sure we have funding to really address some of these problems, to make sure that number one, we understand it, because again, the data is sorely lacking on so many different levels. When we're talking about the Asian American community, what is our actual literacy rate? What is our actual proficiency rate? What is our actual adoption rate, right? And making sure we have that data and then breaking out that data within our different Asian communities. But then after that is, if we understand that problem even more, is making sure sort of the federal government, FCC, is providing oversight, providing funding for these different places where we need to bridge that literacy gap, bridge that proficiency gap, right? And really sort of talk about that in a smart way. So that's a brief overview of some of the things that all of us are looking at, why it's important to our community, the gaps that exist, including gaps in data. I think we could also certainly talk about in the COVID-19 environment, but we can leave that for a little bit further on, because I'm definitely very interested in hearing what Joanne has to say in terms of, because she's working with the community, right? I'm working at a national level, so I see some of this, right? But to be able to understand it is understanding the personal stories too. David, mute. Yes.
Yes, trying to get off mute. Thanks, John, for going over all that. COVID has come up so many times already, and I think we'll come back to that a little bit later. But yeah, why don't we bring in Joanne here to bring a little bit of the kind of local, the real life perspective that we've already brought in a little bit. Both John and I have been both commiserating here, obviously, about our experience as parents. But Joanne, you've certainly seen some things locally. Joanne Lee is Special Counsel on Language Justice for the Legal Aid Foundation of Los Angeles. She is bilingual in Korean and has provided direct legal services to growing Asian Pacific American Islander immigrant population in the LA area at LAFLA since 2000. She practices family and immigration law with a focus on representing domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking survivors before the family and immigration courts, as well as other administrative bodies. She has also filed administrative complaints and litigation based on state, federal civil rights language access requirements to obtain meaningful language services for her clients. She has served on the California Judicial Council Language Access Plan Implementation Task Force, and she has also served on the boards of the Korean American Bar Association, the Korean Resource Center, and the Center for the Pacific Asian Family. So Joanne, if you could maybe share with us what you've been seeing in the LA community, particularly with the role of language access, or maybe the lack thereof, and how what role that plays in technology access.
Sure. Is it okay if I share something on my screen?
Yes, please do.
Okay. Go ahead and do that. And if you could see that. Thank you so much for having me on. I just thought I would start talking about some things that we've seen in LA as well as California by providing just a little bit of very brief demographic background. And I know that many of you are well aware that there's a large population of individuals in the US who speak a language other than English at home, 65 million, and a large portion of that are from the AAPI community. you can see that about 25 million of those are limited English proficient. Those are individuals who self-identify as speaking English less than very well. And you can see there is a significant number, as John mentioned, about 5 million who are from the AAPI community. And there are numerous language groups that compose some of the top ones listed here, like Chinese, Vietnamese, Korean, Tagalog. It goes without saying that in LA, our numbers are also very diverse, as you can imagine. And so just some data points that I'm sure you already know, but limited English proficiency does have, provides many challenges in terms of poverty levels, education opportunities, even healthcare. Let's see, sorry, I'm toggling between. There are a number of legal protections against discrimination based on national origin, which includes language and being limited English proficient. And that means that government entities and those who receive government funding have to provide meaningful language access, which means a combination of different levels of sign or oral interpreting. It could be in person, it could be through various remote platforms, as we've seen a lot recently. It could be through the use of trained bilingual staff, as well as written translations for vital documents. So these are some examples of the federal mandates. Obviously, Title VI is the big one that we talk about. There's some others that are more specific. And then this is, I'm not gonna go through these, but these are just, some states and local cities have their own ordinances that have similar protections. And so as advocates in the legal community, we argue and fight for these protections for our clients, and we've defined language rights in various ways to be free from discrimination, to have meaningful access to public services, and to maintain our non-dominant languages and pass them on to future generations, as well as everyone's languages to be valued and respected. So despite all of this, there's still a great deal of language oppression and trauma in our communities. These are just some examples of news articles, and you could see outlined in blue in the time of COVID. They've really been magnified even more. There are people who are limited English proficient who are not being able to access healthcare, who are not able to access unemployment claims, which I'll talk a little bit more in detail about. And so as we think about language barriers and discrimination that affect our communities, issues around the digital divide add a whole nother complex layer to these challenges, as we've all seen. Many of our community members have preferred to contact us in person, like through walking in or at various community clinics. That all went away as many organizations and government agencies closed their public doors, but they said you can contact us online or by phone or by video chat. And many of our community members did not have, as we've talked about, internet connection. There were limits on their phone data and minutes. They didn't have smartphones or home computers or printers. And this was a big one. There was a large percentage of people who were just completely unfamiliar with electronic forms, how to sign things electronically. Many didn't even have an email address. We had to help them create them. They weren't used to using texting as a form of reliable communication to find out what's happening with their benefits. And as I said, many of these benefits were basically exclusively available only through online portals in English and sometimes in Spanish, and that was about it. And obviously there were, as we've all heard, increased risks in cases of domestic violence survivors being very isolated during this time. And so during the pandemic, many of these complex layers around language discrimination and the digital divide sort of came to a head as we saw many of our linguistically marginalized communities unable to access accurate and reliable information. So it seems like every website had constant updates. This is happening now. We're closed. Now we're open. We're open for this and not that. And very few of these materials were translated into AAPI languages. And this was coming from the courts, from schools, even the media. Sometimes they were in Spanish, and many of our community members were not getting information, critical information about, stay-at-home orders or, what was available, how, students could pick up educational materials. And there was a large use of Google Translate, which, we've always said it has, even though it has technologically advanced a lot, it is still not a reliable form of translation without human review. And so it seems like a lot of agencies were relying on that. By just putting that on their website, they thought they had covered their duties to translate. We also saw a lot of barriers, as I said, in access to benefits and services. Many COVID-related benefits were only online, only in English and maybe Spanish. In addition to the tech barriers, there was also limited literacy and also fear based on immigration status, especially public charge. A lot of these factors, in addition to the digital divide, were preventing and precluding many of our community members from getting access to benefits and services. And then access to qualified interpreters. Many agencies sort of went into panic mode, and they didn't provide qualified interpreters. They were asking for random volunteers to come and help them. And so, we heard reports in hospitals and, schools not providing interpreters that they should have been providing. So what are some of the approaches? I mean, as a nonprofit organization, we had to take great steps to assist our clients in navigating all these various programs, how to download applications, how to utilize the online portals, applying on their behalf, creating email addresses for them, showing them how to check them and update the information they had to put in their portals. Many organizations came together to assist with that. We collaborated so that we could split up translations in different languages and teach them how to write letters to their landlord that they couldn't pay their rent and take advantage of the eviction protections and things like that. And as we taught them how to utilize things like Facebook and YouTube for information, many of these community-based groups were putting up these ad hoc sort of how-to videos or informational updates. And that has been a huge source of information in language for many communities. And so you saw things on how to get unemployment insurance and how to, what courts were open and where you could get access to healthcare, things like that, just popping up on different YouTube channels. Also, we've had to provide a lot of equipment, even to our own staff. Like some of the small nonprofits were not equipped to go remote. And so, we provided hotspots and Wi-Fi access, information on how to access technology, how to access video platforms. Even interpreters who were not used to being remote interpreters have had to get training on, privacy concerns. What equipment do we use? Do we have, high-speed broadband internet access so that our voices don't break up? Or if you're a sign language interpreter, do you have, the high level of connection that people can actually understand what you're signing? So, those are really critical things. And as courts now, some courts are mandating remote hearings and others are making it optional, but they're highly encouraging everybody to appear remotely. And so that's a whole nother layer. I mean, how are our clients gonna appear for their court hearings? So we've been thinking about, as the courts start to reopen, how do we create alternate spaces for them, like in our offices or in libraries, like a studio for WebEx or Zoom or whatever, so that they don't have to rely on the equipment that they have or they may not have at home. Otherwise, they risk having to go in and expose themselves to COVID. And so all of these things, it's just sort of layer upon layer of barriers. And so one thing that we've been doing is a lot of advocacy and trying to hold the government and government-funded entities accountable for not just saying, okay, let's translate these 10 documents, but really strategizing, planning, budgeting, allocating the appropriate resources to provide true, meaningful access instead of having it all fall on the community groups that are already stretched really thin. I'll give you an example. In California, we have an employment development department that administrates all of the unemployment and pandemic unemployment assistance benefits. And historically, a lot of the applications had been done by phone and they were providing interpretation over the phone, but obviously the phone lines are completely jammed. And so they encourage people to apply online, and it's only in English and Spanish. And so we had many community members completely desperate, unable to apply. They're, paying random people like brokers in the community to get benefits. And when they get those benefits, they have to then pay a portion of their benefits to those individuals in order to get, their benefits to continue. And these brokers who are sort of preying on these vulnerable people are saying, well, I'm going to hold on to your password and username. And so you have to come back every time you need to like recertify for benefits. And then there's a lot of that going on in various communities. And we have monitored as we try to help some of these individuals call and follow up on their claims. And they're told, okay, we don't have anybody who speaks Korean, but you'll get a call back. So they're not actually trying to get an interpreter on the line, and then they never get a call back. So essentially, people who don't speak English or Spanish have been completely shut out of the process. And so these are things that, obviously we are helping people with individual cases, and many groups are actually providing all of the interpretation so that these folks can get on the benefits, but we're also trying to put pressure on the government agencies to improve their language services, to translate more documents, to have more bilingual staff members, to contract with, a third-party language service provider. And so these are some of the things that we've been trying to do to improve sort of the complexity of the digital divide and language barriers. But obviously, like you talked about, legislation, including that would be also very useful. And so, there's many strategies that we can work on at the community level, and also, the folks in DC and on the government level, policymakers as well.
Thank you so much, Joanne. For John and Maddie, we've seen already the CARES Act in response to COVID, and now the HEROES Act. What are some of the things that we've been trying to get into those pieces of legislation to perhaps support organizations like Joanne's to make sure that we do have those translated services?
Maddie, do you want to go? Do you want me to go first?
Either way, I can talk a little bit. I can give a little prelude for you, build it up for you. As David talked about, we saw some emergency benefit around broadband service, including unlimited data and minutes from Lifeline internet providers during emergency situations or emergency time periods, included in the HEROES Act. So that was a great provision. It came as a result of a lot of advocacy on the part of organizations like ours. But we continue to need pressure to get these provisions passed by the Senate and get it into the Senate version of the HEROES Act. Other broadband bills that are related to these issues include the Supporting Higher Education Students in Need Act and the Emergency Broadband Connections Act of 2020. Both of those work at the intersection of tech and education issues in order to get broadband access for everyone. Yeah, Don, you want to follow up?
Sure. I think you've hit upon the major pieces, and then certainly we're trying to advocate for language access funding, especially as it relates to healthcare, because on the first COVID-19 stimulus package, there was some funding available for small businesses, but there was none for healthcare. So that was a major omission. Frankly, that still continues to be an omission in the HEROES Act, if I remember right. That has to be addressed. And then, with respect to the HEROES Act, the other thing that has been a push that we've been successful on so far, recognizing, and we'll talk about this in a second, is making sure that the HEROES Act is not limited to people that have Social Security numbers, right? That was a significant failing in the first COVID-19 package, so that it left out a lot of immigrants, and including immigrants that had what were called mixed status families. Someone was a citizen, but they had other people in their family that were not. They were left out of the package, right? And so when Maddie's talking about these credits for the Lifeline service, one of the things that was important to us is that credit tracks who is getting stimulus funding, so that it's not limited only to citizens or something along those lines. I think the reality for the people in the audience is that we need everyone to let their voices be known. There's definitely resistance right now to additional stimulus funding. I think at the end of the day, at least the reading of the tea leaves, so to speak, in DC is that there will be something that will happen. But whether that includes this piece in particular, these are the pieces that are the most endangered, right, in the negotiations. And so for people to really call your members of Congress, especially in the swing states, especially in people that are, I'm going to name it as, is the Republicans have been the ones that have been resistant to some of these packages. And so if you are a constituent, I do think, and I am lobbying here, but that's okay because I do have some money as part of my budget that's for lobbying. It is appropriate and important for people to let their voices be known.
Definitely. And to clarify exactly what John is talking about, just to reiterate one more time, what we're getting at here is for folks to call their representatives to advocate for stimulus payments for individuals with ITIN numbers, taxpayer identification numbers, instead of just social security numbers. Another thing that John didn't mention is that I'm pretty sure either in the HEROES Act or a separate bill that I recently read, folks were expanding Lifeline to include people or households that have gotten Pell Grants in the past. That's also a huge win for us and a huge win for expanding Lifeline and just general tech access. Yeah, and just making sure that we are encouraging our representatives to push forward the Lifeline minutes and data provisions in order to preserve and intensify internet and communications access for everyone, so that everyone can have access to this healthcare, these classes as fall semester starts again, unemployment insurance, all kinds of things.
I think the other aspect is that we don't want to just look at COVID response, that a lot of these issues are going to be continuing permanently, essentially. I think there's going to be much more distance learning, for example, in schools. And we don't know how long this pandemic will even be going on. And that's the other issue, that this is not a short-term thing. But even beyond the pandemic, that these will be ongoing issues with access and digital literacy as well. It looks like we do have a sort of question or comment here about technology and voting. How do we secure online voting? Would one of you like to address that?
Well, actually, part of the HEROES Act does include, I believe, $3.6 billion for additional assistance with respect to security of voting, including mail-in ballots. So this is not just on the technology side.
Yes.
But again, this is a place that there is resistance to including that in any package. So I think that is clearly something for which additional advocacy / education is necessary. And I think the other aspect of this, though, is that we can't put all of our eggs into one basket, so to speak, right? That online voting, online registration, voter registration is not going to be the magic bullet. Mail-in ballots is not going to be the magic bullet, because for our communities, right, if we're talking about mail-in ballots, that requires us to have translated ballots. That requires our communities to understand how mail-in ballots work. So we have to make sure that when we're talking about voting, to take this question and extrapolate a little bit, that's an all of the above choice, that we have to think about what polling centers look like. We have to expand the notion of early voting, right? Because all of those are going to be important for our community.
Now, John, I know you're going to be actually doing another panel later this evening, but did you want to talk a little bit about census as well and the role that technology is playing? And
yeah, I was going to bring that up.
Oh, man, you can go ahead and talk.
Or John, either way. But what I was going to say is that the online elements is actually less applicable for voting and much more applicable for census. As we're seeing that a lot of folks are filling out the census online this time around. As John mentioned, in the HEROES Act, we got $400 million to ensure the integrity of the 2020 census, especially with all of the online census filling forms. So that was really great. And that is another thing that we should be pushing for in terms of the Senate version.
Yeah. I think one of the maybe the successes that technology has brought about, obviously with so much of what we're talking about today is around COVID. We've seen a lot of anti-Asian hate, discrimination. Some of that happens online. But I know that both AJC and OCA operate a sort of hate incidents reporting system online, and that has actually been really great way to actually be capturing a lot of what's been going on. Do you want to talk a little bit about what you've been seeing through that, and maybe some of the stories as well that might be technology related?
You're muted, John.
I'd be happy to. So both of our organizations, as well as the Asia Pacific Policy and Planning Council and Chinese for Affirmative Action out in California, all of us have websites for self-reporting. And on one level, this is a good and a bad thing. On one level, we have been getting, all of us have been getting reports. We've been working together to sort of document that and tell that story and make sure that that narrative is understood by reporters, understood by the general public as to how harmful certain words are and how it affects our community. But I want to be careful about that because these are still voluntary reports and these are online reports. Now, there is actually a phone number that you could call with the Lawyers Committee that can track these as well. But all of this requires voluntary efforts. And so this, again, is where we really need more funding from the federal government and from state governments to really understand the depths of some of these problems. And so, here you could hear a common refrain, especially for the Asian American community. One is we're underfunded, whether it's by the federal government, state and local governments. Two is we don't have the data. Certainly that's the case with respect to hate incidents as well, is that there must be greater investment of resources. Actually, I'm going to say both the government as well as private entities, if you look at Pew Research as an example, to remember how the Asian American community, which is the fastest growing community, fits into this narrative of who we are as America.
Yeah, and now that we're talking about hate crimes and advocacy on behalf of that, we should also bring up the Jabara Hayer No Hate Act, which also made it into the HEROES Act, and it needs to be definitely a huge. We need to fight for the Jabara Hayer No Hate Act to make it into the Senate version because it needs to be a priority for this country and it needs to be passed. It's been kind of on the docket for many years now. And that is the kind of bill that would provide funding for hate crimes hotlines and more just investigation and reporting measures around the country.
Yeah, so clear that data collection is just so important to everything here. Not just technology, but all areas of everything that we all do in this area. We're coming to the end of our hour. Did anybody want to have anything else they'd like to add? We haven't covered. Closing remarks.
I think the only thing I would reiterate is thank you to everyone that tuned into this. Hopefully it helped you get an understanding of what we're talking about when we talk about the digital divide and some of the gaps that exist in our community. If it motivates you to do something about it, whether it is to talk to your local representative or your federal representatives, that's wonderful. As Joanne pointed out, I think there are definitely places that there are gaps, especially in translation. And we don't want to be in a position that we are relying on volunteers and staff to be doing translations. At the same time, I think Joanne would agree with me that if that's what we need to do, all of us are committed to making that happen. So if you are bilingual, trilingual, and fluent in another language that could really help our community right now, please sign up because I think we need you really right now.
Yes, exactly. Everything that John said. Thank you so much for tuning in. And if you're here, it means that you care about this issue. And we're just really grateful that you're invested in our community in this way.
Yeah, thank you to everyone for tuning in today. Thank you to all of our panelists, Joanne, Maddie, John, Congressman Khanna, and Congressman Liu. I think the panel has really highlighted the important role that Asian Pacific Americans do play in the tech field, both from the community side and our leaders in Congress as well. I think it's also important to note, as John did, that we do work with those from the industry as well, with several great partners who are also doing great work to bridge the divide. Before we do go, as I mentioned earlier, John is actually going to be on another panel later this evening in about an hour. That's called Mapping Our Future, From Census to Building Political Power for the Next 10 Years. And there will be another panel going on about mobilizing Oceania. So both of those begin at 7 o'clock Eastern time. So please do tune into those. They'll be available again through the Zoom or on Facebook Live. And of course, need to put in a final plug for the presidential town hall this Saturday, again, 3 o'clock p.m. Eastern time. Being the tech table, I will let those of you who are not Eastern time zone, let you do the math to figure out the time when it will be showing in your own time zone. We do want to thank API Vote for hosting the town hall and all of these policy briefings in the lead up to the town hall. And also thank you to the NCAPA staff who have been working behind the scenes to make this all run so seamlessly and coordinating everything. So thank you all for tuning in, and we will see you again on Saturday.
Thank you, David.